So I've been seeing a lot of interesting stuff about the FBI lately, and it's really gotten me thinking, and I've been ruminating with a lot of these thoughts in my head, and just wanted to kind of throw out maybe some of my perspective given my historical knowledge. I've heard a lot of you like my American history videos, so I'm going to try to keep those up because that's actually the area I have a degree in. So I might talk about this a little bit more today. Sorry in advance. I'm getting over a cold still. You can probably hear it in my voice. I had one of the reasons I haven't uploaded that, and lots of stuff's going on in my day-to-day life that I've been having to attend to, going through move, lots of other major life events. All right, let's just jump right into the topic today. So I think this is mostly because this has been ruminating for the past year or so, and it's kind of bubbled up now that Trump is being investigated for crimes, and Joe Biden and Hunter Biden scandals and all these impeachment things. And I am going to talk about what's going on with that. Is it reasonable to think that the FBI is, a left-wing conspiracy organization, or trying to push left-wing political goals? What's going on with the FBI? The FBI used to be this, pretty strident conservative political institution. Most people that railed against the FBI for the past 100 years in the United States were left-wing people, saying that it was pushing, Nixon's agenda or whatever. But now it feels like the people who don't trust the FBI are left-wingers, and a lot of news people I've seen are very confused about this. If you ever talk to anybody in the FBI, these guys seem pretty conservative. Why do right-wingers feel this way? And I'm going to try to explain that a little bit through history, and it's not going to be as simple as they are or aren't, but I'm going to try to explain why it's starting to feel this way, like they're not really on our side, so to say. So first of all, we're going to have to talk about institutions. So a lot of times, people kind of have this view of democracies and societies in general that they kind of operate as build. So they might think that in a monarchy or a dictatorship or whatever, well, there's the guy at the top who claims to have total power, so he clearly does. But then when you study history, you realize, oh, wow, this guy actually has to deal with a lot of more powerful institutions underneath him. The same thing is true about democracies. A lot of people feel like we live in a democracy, so people vote on stuff, and once we vote, we get an elected representative. That elected representative does what we want. Or sometimes they even have maybe a more cynical view that also isn't really true, which is just that, X people with big money pay politicians to get what they want out of our institutions. But there are a lot of competing institutions. One of those would be financial influence. Another would be popular sovereignty. This kind of populist movement. They definitely give institutional power. I think that's kind of the lesson we're learning with Donald Trump. But there are lots of other institutions. There's universities, education, religious institutions, financial institutions. And these institutions have affiliated elites, and they have affiliated clients. So you might think you're like, I'm a client? Am I a client? And in a way, yes, everyone is a client of some institution or another. Now, today, it's hard to think, what am I even a client of? Well, there are people and things that you're interested in, or that you're affiliated with, that you participate in, that have people who run those organizations. So if you're a Protestant, it's pretty obvious that there is usually your denomination. And then the denomination has if you're an Anglican like me, it has the bishops, the archbishop, the influential higher-ups of the institution. And you tithe and pay and do all your stuff to participate and contribute to that institution. Catholic Church is an institution. It's a much more organized institution. It's a much more obvious elites. It has much more obvious hierarchy. But even within that institution, the Catholic Church is a great example, there are sub-institutions. There are the Dominican Order, the Jesuits, the Franciscans. These guys all have their own influences. They have their own goals or whatever, and they have their clientele. So while the regular parish priest has a very small clientele of his congregation, they're going to start going up the hierarchy, and the bishop has his clientele of the lower priests, and that starts to accumulate and get distance. As you go up, you get some less direct influence. You get more direct influence when you go down the hierarchy. But another problem we're having today is we don't have as many of these kinds of interactions. So in a previous society, and we'll get into these more, especially we'll get into this more as the PowerPoint goes on, but especially in earlier phases of American democracy, you'd be participating in a number of institutions, and all of those institutions would have you as a client, and you would actually have a couple associated institutional elites. Now, people rail against institutions because oftentimes, and this is also very true, it can be pretty obvious when the institutional elites are ignoring their clientele. And there's not a lot, depending on the institution, stopping them from doing this or making the decision that we should, stop caring about their clientele. Some institutions are very good about trying to make this. Democracy is an attempt to make sure that institutional elites do care about their clientele. But unions are a good example. A lot of times, if you look into the history of the United States, you can easily corrupt even a democracy or a democratic system to make sure that the institutional elites have more authority. You can look at the political boss systems in the United States history, and those things, they can be very easily abused. And so lots of very complicated systems have been created to try to avoid that problem of institutional corruption and alienation. So what ends up actually happening, and people know this even in democracies, know this subconsciously, even if it's hard to prove to them, they know who their institutional elites are, and they know who their clientele associations are. So some people will often say, the same argument made by different people doesn't hit well. I was just listening to, one second. I was just listening to Anthony Fantano, who is a left-wing music news guy or music reviewer, talk about the new Oliver Anthony song. And he goes on, and it's very biased, I think, of his description of the Oliver Anthony song. For those who don't know, the Oliver Anthony song was this, just blew up of this. It's a pretty good country song of this guy kind of railing against what are called the rich men north of Richmond in his song. And some people are saying, and Anthony Fantano is arguing that it's a dog whistle about North versus South relations, even though if you just look at a map, north of Richmond is Washington, D.C. So it's really just him railing against politicians, which makes more sense with the rest of the lyrics of the song, with him railing against policies. Now, of course, Anthony Fantano likes those policies, so he goes on to the whole video to argue, oh, this is stupid, this is stupid, this is stupid. But at the very end of Anthony Fantano's review, he's very clear to say, oh, actually, all of the things he's complaining about in this video are true. He just doesn't understand that he's wrong and his solutions are wrong and my solutions are correct. And he's stupid because he's right-wing, but if he was left-wing, he would recognize that my solutions are correct. And Anthony Fantano doesn't argue for that position. He just kind of knows. And you can tell the whole video while he's reviewing the song, what's actually going on in his head is he realizes this Southern person railing against the same problems he rails against is not a part of the same clientele institution system that he is a part of. And so he has to dismiss this person, even though he says in the video he agrees with most of the problems that this guy has, and starts talking about military spending being the real problem. But that's not really, I don't even know if Oliver Anthony would disagree that we spend too much on the military. It doesn't come up in the song. But what Anthony Fantano correctly recognizes is that this song is participating in an institution battle. It's affiliated with right-wing institutions, and it's claiming the same problems. And so because it's giving credence and social capital to a right-wing institution through right-wing clientele and right-wing language and right-wing affiliated social stuff, he knows as a left-winger who's a left-wing client and to some extent a left-wing institution participant as a music reviewer and cultural connoisseur, he's recognizing the problem going on here. And so he has to combat it. But really what's going on is an institution battle. Even in these circles that seem informal, they don't seem political, or they don't seem Like they have to do with a democratic election or some kind of institution. They do. And we play out these clientele battles in our lives all the time. To show you how obvious it is, I think researching history can do this for lots of people. You look into a period of time or a place different than your own. I think C.S. Lewis said that the reason we should read history is to remove our biases. And the irony of people today who are very against bias is that they don't care about history, or they rewrite history for their own ends. But a lot of times, history is the only way we can really overcome our own temporal biases, because we go to different places and different people with different attitudes, and we can see, oh, all right, okay, well, what did they think about this? How did they think? What does this reflect upon our current systems? Because humans are roughly the same organism we were at that time. So in American history, this is before the foundation of the FBI, for those who are wondering, we had what was called the third party system. And I've done a video on this before, but this is not that there were three parties. There was still the Democratic and the Republican Party, but it was a period of time after the Civil War and roughly right before World War I, where there was a large Republican dominance of the government, the institutions, and all these things. And what you see is, obviously, the Republican Party starts with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln becomes president. The Civil War is this cataclysmic big shift. What ends up happening is, because the Southerners retreat from the federal government, institutions of federal government, and they literally secede, and then there's a big civil war, and many Confederates cannot vote any longer. You get this huge boom of the Republican Party takeover of the federal government. And, I mean, it's kind of inevitable, because the people who disagree with them are largely not participating in politics in this country anymore, because they're trying to make their own. So even after the Civil War, you still have this dominance by Republicans. And Republicans inherit the previous party system a little bit, which I'll touch on, which was also the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party's opponents were what were called the Whigs. And the Whigs identified as conservative, the conservative party of their time, but you wouldn't think of them necessarily in the same way we think of conservative versus liberal today. So their conservatism was, it was big business. Of course, they wanted low tariffs to instigate trade, but it also did have to do with returning to a simplistic America. There were a lot of, I would just say mostly northern business interests, but also settlers, log cabin kind of guys. Millard Fillmore is the president who was born in a log cabin, and he becomes a president while he's a Whig. Of course, the Whigs don't really get a lot of presidency, and they don't get a lot of political capital, because the period before the Civil War was defined not by Republican dominance, but by Democratic dominance in the wake of Andrew Jackson and his political successes. Now, I won't go into that quite yet. Maybe I'll do another video on that long trajectory, but the Whigs, in large part, are business people, kind of intellectual northern elites. You get Horace Greeley over here, who's kind of he's a journalist. You get a lot of military men like Winfield Scott, who run for office. You get kind of this eclectic bunch of outside institutions kind of trying to scramble into the establishment, democratic establishment, which was this kind of, it started populist, and then and there was this political spoil system, and so the political elite of the country were Democrats, and so these other groups are trying to vie to get in, and they're resisting this kind of tension between northern technocrats and maybe southern political elites that started with the Virginia dynasty and go into Jackson and all that stuff. Okay, I won't spend too much time on that, because that's not what I want to talk about here. But anyway, the Republicans, after their enormous success, inherit a lot of the Whig power structures. They kind of get involved. But the Republicans bring into it a key voter base. So they maintained that military institutional control with Winfield Scott that comes into like Ulysses S. Grant. And they definitely kind of, again, all of the military officials who would have been sympathetic to the Democratic Party were just on the losing side of a civil war, and most of them fought for the other guys. So most of the military is affiliated with the Republican Party. They inherit a lot of that New York, Philadelphia, Boston journalist culture. They inherit also that kind of log cabin Midwest culture, and they bring in this kind of evangelical abolitionist group. And so a lot of the evangelicals of the time, who kind of mix with that log cabin grassroots part of the Republican Party, that evangelical tide comes into the Republican Party a lot stronger. And you get this kind of idea of social reform is a key element of the Republican platform. And abolition is now successful. And looking back on it, a lot of these evangelicals are like, this was our major success. We are moral reformers. A lot of them start to get into prison reform. A lot of them start to get into guaranteeing public education, all of these kinds of reforms. And what they kind of want to do is they want to create this model society of morals and virtue. And, you know, they're kind of envisioning this like, oh, we all kind of perfect ourselves as we build these new things. And so they're building institutions in a lot of ways. Prison reform, penitentiaries. Penitentiary, right, it means penance, right? It's a lot of these early Christians are the ones that are putting forward these kinds of things. They're very for the idea of reform. A lot of this stuff starts to veer, though, in different groups. But during this period of Republican dominance, actually, it's within the Republican Party that you start to see a lot of this competition. This competition stems from issues with the political patronage and the spoils system. So while the different factions of the Republican Party, which were usually, you know, from maybe one end to the other, are called the stalwarts. So the stalwarts are the kind of older Republicans. They're very loyal to the party. They're for what's called the political patronage system. They kind of want to give political offices and institutional control to people who they know will be loyal to the Republican Party. And they're in conflict with other Republicans led by what are called the half-breeds, but they'll have a splinter off into what are called the mugwumps. You can't make these names up. The half-breeds are saying, oh, well, we should have a kind of civil service system that doesn't have loyalties to this political machine, and that this civil service will do all of those programs, all those things we were talking about before. They'll take care of them from the it's kind of vague. Maybe the federal government down, maybe the state government's down, but basically these civil servants will do a lot for our country, and they shouldn't be just loyal to us. And you kind of start to see the split between the stalwarts, who are more establishment politicians, and the half-breeds, and eventually the mugwumps, who are those kinds of journalists, evangelical types, who are more concerned with social change. Those social supporters ditch James Blaine, who's running for office, and instead they support the only successful Democratic campaign, or the mugwumps are the ones who do split from the Republican Party and vote for Grover Cleveland, who's the only successful Democratic presidential candidate in this period, because he's willing to bend a little bit to a faction of Republicans. What that shows, though, at the time, is that Grover Cleveland and the Democrats in general are largely regional institutions. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you research anything about this period, you'll know that the South is controlled by Democrats, and the Democrats are doing everything they can to maintain that strict institutional control. They're reforming voting methods in the South, that are making sure that black people can't vote, so that there's no Republican way for the Republican Party to win in the South. Republicans attempted this for a while. You can look into carpetbaggers and things like this, and other Republican attempts to break the Democratic voting bloc in this period, which is not happening. It's just not going to work. And the Democrats try to do their own things, and we'll get into like William Jennings Bryan and stuff. But anyway, most of the institutions controlled by the Democrats at the time are regional and statewide, versus the Republicans are having these conversations about federal civil service and programs in the military, and expanding the American empire, and expanding our borders, and all of these conversations about federal power and federal offices and federal institutions, and creating all of these institutions of civil society. If you are a Protestant, for instance, in a small denomination, I dare you to look up your small denomination. A good example of this would be the Christian Reformed Church, which is mostly Dutch immigrants, but those Dutch immigrants are part of the Christian Reformed Church, and a lot of their leaders start to become infatuated with the Republican Party, and so the Dutch Christian Reformed Church becomes associated with this period's Republican Party because of the social reforms and all these things. And so this institution, which is religious, ends up becoming a core sub-institution of this larger political platform. And so what you get at this time, and I'm kind of trying to point this out with this divide between the mugwumps and the stalwarts and the half-breeds, is that this period you have a two-party system. You have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but you get this kind of subsidiarity, these smaller parties, which are kind of clumps of smaller institutions that can kind of move around. The mugwumps are a good example of this. When they're not getting what they want, they go to the Democratic Party to get the reforms that they are hoping for. And this kind of system was, in a way, similar to the parliamentary system. And you'll see later on there are divides over prohibition and the gold standard versus the silver standard versus going off of the gold standard and all these things. All of these sub-issues, which are important to different institutions for different reasons, start to inform politics from a decentralized mechanism. And you do get, despite enormous amounts of corruption, you actually get a period of political stability. So people look into this era of political bosses and all these things, and they say, oh, wow, the Gilded Age, all this stuff was so rotten to the core, right? Look at all this corruption. But actually, I mean, if you don't really have any illusions about democracy ever being this kind of grassroots movement of populism and we vote for the smartest guy and he gets the office and we all sing Kumbaya. If you understand that that's not how it works, you actually see this period of an enormous amount of institutions all battling for the interests of their clientele. And in some ways, you get this boom of energy, economic growth, settlement, right? There's an enormous wave of immigration to the United States from different groups trying to start their own communities. You get this westward expansion, and you get the growth of the railroad, and America becomes a world power in this period because it has this kind of vibrant life, and at the same time, we maintain our political institutions. So as corrupt as this period was in by elections and things like that, you don't get like a dictator taking control of the United States. And you might say, well, of course, because of our Constitution. But if you look at the history of South American countries at the exact same time, they had very similar constitutions, they had very similar people, they had very similar problems that we did, like in our Civil War, which was a struggle between urban. You can see this in all kinds of American countries at the time, including South American countries. You see the struggle between large landowners, which inherit the political interests of our previous colonial overseers. So you use the Spanish, and you can see this really clearly in Argentina. You get these giant land estate owners. You see this in Brazil, and they are kind of conflicting with an urban, more business elite, and you get that conflict, and it usually results in one group getting a dictator, or a caudillo, as they're called in the southern United States. But we don't have that problem in the United States, and I think it's because of this large number of institutions that are being fostered, partially because of Protestantism, right? Because in the South America, I mean, you kind of just have the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church's influence is unitary, versus all of these different Protestant groups, like I'm talking about the CRC, all these whatever, they're competing. The Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodists, they're all competing for influence, and they sharing parties. In a previous video, I showed how in the third party system, each religious group of Protestants voted for a different party, and even the Catholics are being courted by the Democrats of this period. For instance, you'll see today we have a lot of conflict over ethnicity, and they did the same thing at the time. So we had a lot of identity politics today, where usually you'll find you talk to somebody about poor people in the United States, and most people say, I have a lot of sympathy for poor people. But if they're a Democrat, what they mean by poor people are urban poor people, usually people of color. And if you're talking about Republicans, they're thinking in their head of rural or suburban poor people or middle class people and all these kinds of things. And what the needs of those different types of low income Americans are very different And because they're competing, and what even those elite members of the party know is that those are my clients. They understand that, and that's how they understand a political machine to work, or any institution to work. And so they'll do whatever they can to support their clients over opposing clients. And it's a subconscious, even to some extent, this effect. That's what I was talking about with Anthony Fantano. And you'll see this at this period too. So in the third party political system, you get this period of eugenics, and a lot of people will, today, most of what we talk about with eugenics and forced sterilization is in reference to what was happening to African Americans being sterilized. And this was true. And lots of Democrats in the South that had political control were trying to do whatever they could, in some sense, to nix or nip the literal voting power, the numbers, the genetic influence of the clientele of their enemy. And it's pretty cynical, and it's pretty sinister when you look into it. However, the same thing is actually happening in the North with Irish Americans. So why Irish Americans? People know today that Irish Americans were considered low class and they were derided and people didn't like them. But it's not until you read people like H.L. Mencken and some other what were conservative H.L. Mencken's a little bit later, but you can read other Republicans at the time, and they're the ones railing against the Irish and other groups of immigrants because, consciously they'll say stuff about them being Catholic, and they'll say stuff about them being poor and the type of jobs that they have and their influence. But in reality, they just know in the back of their head, these guys vote for the Democrats, they're the bad guys. And then you'll read Republicans of the exact same period talking about the potential of the untapped potential of the African American voter in the United States, and how we need to work on their education. And you get characters like Booker T. Washington who get a lot of political support from the Republican Party at the time, because that's what they're pushing. And you might say, oh, so Republicans weren't racist, or they were racist just against Irish people. Until you kind of break the veil a little bit and you realize, oh, well, it's kind of just about associated institutions, right? And they know that the African Americans at that time are going to vote for them because they were the abolition party and all that kind of stuff. And they know that the Irish won't vote for them, so they don't like the Irish. And so you kind of get the elites have their, it's really bad. You can look into what happened in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of poor white voters were sterilized, criticized. You get a lot of derision against Hicks and hillbillies. You get a lot of kind of negative talk about that part of America. It's pretty obvious when you read characters like H.L. Mencken, who talks about eventually the Scopes Monkey trial and the associated grassroots democratic movements with William Jennings Bryan, which are more white, Southerner, Midwesterner, and he kind of just hates these people. And you're like, wow, you have such a vitriol for these people. And you can kind of see how that's been inherited today a little bit. What ends up happening is that the Democratic Party realizes their disadvantages pretty consciously. You can read Woodrow Wilson, who at this time was, I think, the president of Princeton University, and he's kind of thinking like, hey, the trends we're seeing today are towards government institutional power, federal power, a strong executive, these kinds of things. And some people have said that his writings in this period resemble what would become fascism, but to some extent, and I'm got to be the millionth person to point this out, it's really just what was kind of progressive at this time. And he's kind of also following in the footsteps of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but he thought, oh, look, the federal government is a good tool to achieve populist goals. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but even though we've described earlier one of the major power bases of the Republican Party at the time were these families like the Vanderbilts and the the Rockefellers, other big business families were a big backbone of the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt galvanizes an entirely different wing of the Republicans. Again, this kind of progressive populist element of the Republican Party to bash another part of the Republican Party. Now, when he's doing this, you get, again, another victory of the Democrat for the first time in a while. So Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, the only Democrats elected until FDR, only even get any federal power at this time because of the failures of internal Republican squabbling. So Woodrow Wilson comes to the fore, and he starts, I think, to play a very cynical game. People will say that at this time, in retrospect, I think even most progressives do not like Woodrow Wilson because of his thoughts about black people and all this kind of stuff, which is, par for the course for any Democrat at the time because those are the enemy clientele. And so what does he think about our clientele, however? It's a different story. So he supports, for instance, eventually the 19th Amendment, which gets ratified to allow women to vote. And he's kind of thinking, okay, well, if we let them vote, this is kind of what happens with the Republicans, right? The Republicans gave all these political liberties to African Americans and other groups, and now they're loyal clientele. So Woodrow Wilson is saying, okay, let's do this with women, and let's do this with other groups. And he also believes in a strong executive. And you can see that when he comes to the fore of the nation during World War I and starts leading this international policy, he kind of sees America as this big power player, and he wants this very strong federal government to be a leader in the world. However, at the time, America is actually too institutionally isolationist. What I think you could say about many of these small institutions in the United States is say, wait, if we leave our attention from the United States, if the federal government and all these questions and all these debates stop being about internal squabbles and they start being about external squabbles, what'll happen to our institutions? Where will we go? We will become irrelevant. And so you kind of get a lot of opposition to that. So Woodrow Wilson founds the League of Nations, but the United States, the Congress, votes not to participate. Again, because there's still a lot of Republican dominance of these organs of government. So he doesn't have the political will to actually see out his vision for a very strong, I would say, State Department, federal government, which can dominate even the entire globe. It doesn't really work out. And you see this period of America returning to isolationism. And then again, after Woodrow Wilson, you go back to the old Republican dominance of government. Those old institutions come back up, and you get the same kind of guys. You get a lot of business-focused people. Let's focus on the economy of the United States again. Warren G. Harding is a controversial, very political figure. He's replaced by Calvin Coolidge, who kind of downplays the power of the federal government. You start to get a lot more of the Republican Party's libertarian bent starts to show up here. So Calvin Coolidge is a very small government business guy, and he's still revered, I think, today by a lot of libertarians. Herbert Hoover inherits that from Calvin Coolidge, and he's still very like the government shouldn't intervene, all this kind of stuff. He's very libertarian economics. So you still get this element of the Republican Party emerging here, and it's always been there. It existed in the Whig Party, like I said before, of them kind of opposing strong federal government and being pro-business. In the Whig period, those aren't as similar, though. In previous periods, being pro-business meant being pro-tariffs and things like that because it would support American businesses over foreign businesses. And you get those debates, and that shifts a lot. But in this period, the Republican Party is being dominated by those kind of business interests. They profited a lot in the wake of World War I, especially American banks offering loans, all those kinds of things. You see a big boom of these institutions, and you can see that reflected in the politics. Then, however, there is the Great Depression crash. A lot of institutions are going under. Financial institutions, social institutions, all these kinds of things. How much are people tithing to churches at this period? I mean, of their income, it's going to go way down. So even those kinds of institutions suffer during the Great Depression. And Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party's kind of more laissez-faire libertarian attitude is no longer appealing. What people want is they want big change, and they want people to give them solutions. Their institutions can't be left on their own to do their own thing anymore. And everything will work out. Those institutions are collapsing, so we need a new institution. We need some new gusto. We need some new power. We need some new intervention, and Hoover kind of starts to get onto this program, by the way, by the end of his administration, but at that point it's too late because it's not really his identity. It's not really what the voter base associates him with, hence like the Hoover Dam and all that stuff, and Hoovervilles, and you can look up this stuff. But he gets into political intervention by the end of his presidency. Regardless, he loses that office, and FDR comes into power. FDR kind of has that Wilson idea to the max. And think about this. They're taking over this Democratic political party base. But what is the Democratic Party at this time? The Democratic Party at this time is, again, a lot of regional institutions. Those institutions want most of the time to be left to their own devices. They don't want all of this kind of... They're wary of the federal government, for instance. They don't have control over the military. They're their own political machines, I guess you could say. They have control in some cities with Catholics, mostly in the north with Irish or German Catholics or Italians or Poles. And they just kind of want to be left to their own. But what FDR can see is he's like, this is not how we win the long game. Look at all these institutions in our country that are dominated by Republicans. We kind of need to flip the switch on them. Even our most, let's look at the religious organizations. The Episcopalians at the time were Democrats to some extent, but they weren't as stalwart. They were a little bit more mixed because, again, a lot of the political elites at the time were Episcopalian. So you do get a big mix there. But most of the actual American Protestant religious groups were affiliated with the Republican Party at the time. And except for the Catholic Church, when the Catholic Church isn't even based in the United States. I mean, they're based in Rome, and lots of Americans at this time are very weary of seeing like they're kowtowing to the church in Rome. And so what FDR can recognize is he says, we're going to be this kind of grassroots element of the Democratic Party, which was started with characters like William Jennings Bryan and other populists, usually in the Midwest. For a brief time, there was what was literally called the Populist Party. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pick up, and he, in a cool symbolism, he's kind of picking up what his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt was doing as well, which was galvanizing large numbers of people to weaponize the federal government to achieve the political ends of his new clientele. The federal government has now becoming its own dominant institution. Okay? And he does this with incredible, crazy, blank check, basically. What Woodrow Wilson was trying to do during World War I, and he was incapable of doing, FDR got the blank check during the Great Depression to try everything. I mean, people will say that a lot of times his policy was going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and those policies will keep going with it. He does a million new federal programs, he makes a million new federal agencies, he makes a million new basically institutions. He just starts institution building rapidly, and there's a lot of opposition to him in the previous institutions, but they don't have the power anymore. They've been so weakened by the Great Depression they can't really go up against him. Now, what World War II does is World War II gives him an even bigger blank check, because now he gets to rapidly expand the military. We're invading foreign countries. We're rebuilding institutions in those countries. And a lot of times he kind of gets this intellectual base on his side as well. So while earlier stages of the Republican Party were dominated by these journalists and intellectual types, what FDR is good at doing is he's good at appealing to like these, higher brow economist type guys, and what's this emerging new interwar elite of people who are skeptical of the old ways of doing things and are semi-socialistic, but not quite going that far. This is where you get John Maynard Keynes, who FDR invites into his administration to kind of work through some of these new economic ideas that he's toying around with. So what you get after FDR? So FDR dies, right? Truman kind of takes over. Truman doesn't have the same kind of vision. You can still see, however, the old political affiliations playing themselves out. So after FDR, after Truman, there's a new president. He's the famous military guy. What party is he going to be a part of? Eisenhower is going to be a Republican. But he's still playing Eisenhower is not a libertarian or something like that, right? He's playing this kind of, he's playing the same game. He's building highway systems, and he's expanding the power of the federal government. But he's also concerned about this kind of new military industrial complex, apparently, and things like that. And so what you're seeing is the emergence of a new political system, really. Because what FDR did was he built this giant bureaucracy of civil servants, which is, you can kind of see that the desire for something goes back pretty far. And so what politics slowly starts to orient around is these institutions that were created elsewhere are starting to be swallowed up by FDR's old bureaucracy. So education was another institution, right? Now that's controlled by his bureaucracy. The legal system you get during the Warren Court gets this huge reform. What do these reforms look like? Well, they look like every indigent defendant is now requires or now can get a free lawyer, even if they can't pay, because that's apparently in the Constitution. What does that actually do on the ground? What that does is it creates this huge public defender system, which is a bunch of lawyers hired by the government to participate in our legal system. A more cynical person would look at, for instance, are these kinds of cases and would realize, wait, both the public defender and the prosecutor are being paid by the government to prosecute this guy. Like, is this a kangaroo court? I mean, I think you have to have a lot of trust in our system to realize that it's not. I mean, like, the public defenders, I mean, if you look at any court case, public defenders do weirdly fight really hard against prosecutors to help defend these clients. I mean, a lot of times they don't. I mean, they've got a lot of cases and things like that. I don't mean to say that they're always amazing or that they're perfect or whatever, but anyway, the point I'm making is that there's this giant expansion of federally paid employees and bureaucrats and all these people. And what ends up happening is this giant FDR bureaucracy starts to basically become the issue for voters. So you see the emergence of what is Barry Goldwater, who is a libertarian, and you're kind of getting this idea that maybe this federal bureaucracy that kind of started with Teddy Roosevelt, got expanded the first time with Woodrow Wilson, and then explodes with FDR. Maybe this federal bureaucracy is starting to swallow up every opposing institution in our country. And we don't really like that. And so you do get, in this period, you still get some of your log cabin, Republicans, like Nixon is a good example, very similar to Millard Fillmore, grew up in a very poor family, kind of pulled himself up, was a very scrappy guy, gets into the political office and is a conservative, isn't totally a libertarian either. He still believes in government power and all these things, but is starting to veer away, starting to distrust a lot of what's going on. What you also start to see is the federal government giving money to universities and all these kinds of intellectual elites. Those guys that FDR brings over, who are these kind of big thinkers, start to have some really weird ideas about monetary policy. What starts with people justifying near ridiculous amounts of excess spending and deficit spending, even in times of, because even if you read John Maynard Keynes, he basically says, oh, when it's the bad times, of course you deficit spend, but when it's good times, you should actually be, paying back all of your debts and stuff. But that's not really what the political machine desires. And so you start to get these people who argue that money isn't real and that it's all backed in government authority. And so the government needs more authority to give the money more strength, and the money needs more strength to give the government more authority. You start to see a lot of intellectuals kind of justifying very strong social policies. So what LBJ is very good at. So you see, then you get JFK, then you get LBJ. And what I think a lot of people re-narrativize this place as, which is the intention, and you can see this with all this kind of idea of the great switch, the great party switch. How did all these characters go from one side of the aisle to the other? And what a lot of the narrative tends to focus on, if you're watching like Knowing Better or Vox cover this period, is, Democrats started being for social programs. Those social programs would benefit minorities. They started to be for civil rights. And then there was a switch. The Republicans, who used to be for civil rights for African Americans, are now against them, and they're the evil guys. So when you're looking through history and you start to think that the Republicans are the good guys because they were supporting abolition, don't think that, because don't worry, transfer all of that support you had for Republicans to the Democrats now, because the Democrats and the Republicans switched. And you get a lot of this kind of thought on this issue. So, you kind of get this, oh, the Democrats used to be the party of the KKK, but now they're the party of Barack Obama. How did that happen? A good example of this also is that lots of other things start to switch over too. So it's not just over this one issue, which I think a lot of people narrowly see all of American history summed up in the conflict between men and women, or the conflict between white Americans and black Americans, when there are lots of other institutions and battles and issues that are going on that were really important to people. So a lot of people don't know that Anderson Cooper, who's a CNN political analyst guy, who is actually Vanderbilt. I think his mom was Gloria Vanderbilt, and he's kind of an inheritor of that kind of social American political elite. The journalist, right? Remember, we're talking about where all these journalists used to kind of favor Republicans at the time, who were for this kind of civil service, kind of do-good America. Now, Anderson Cooper is a homosexual news analyst for CNN and is very liberal and covers all this stuff, I think, in a very biased way. I would be surprised if he supported the Republican Party and he's kind of switched over to the Democratic Party. And you'll see people talk about like Strom Thurmond and all this stuff. How did this happen? What's actually going on? I think is the question. What a lot of people will point out in this period is you get this shift. So you can see in the third party system, this is an amalgamation of all the elections that took place during the third party system. The South is very Democratic, votes for the Democrats, and the rest of the country votes for the Republicans pretty consistently, or actually the Populist Party in some other states, but you kind of get that shift. However, you can kind of see in this most recent election, it looks a little flipped now, doesn't it? Looks like the South, with some exceptions, I think I'm covering Florida right now with my face, but most of the South is Republican, and the rest of the country are Democrats. But what might kind of put a wrench in this description a little bit is the Midwest didn't change, did it? So you can see in third party system, places like Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana. These places are all Republican, and they're still Republican even after this alleged party switch. So what actually happened? Why does the South kind of vote for the Republicans now, and why does the North now vote for the Democrats? What really changed here? This gets us to the presidency of LBJ. So LBJ inherits the throne, if you will, because of the death of JFK. You'll notice there's this kind of tendency on the Democratic affiliated institutions to make these acronyms, right? So Reagan will later call this stuff like word soup, or or not word soup, or I'm forgetting the funny little quirky name for them, but the bit is like you get the FDA and the EPA and all these things, they all have acronyms. So do all the Democratic presidents of the time, FDR, JFK, LBJ. And JFK is kind of this traditional Democrat from one of the traditional Democratic groups, and he's a Catholic, and he's kind of, taking a little bit of what was starting to develop with this idea of civil rights Democrats, and he's kind of pushing that a little bit. And he's kind of pretty moderate about it, though. I mean, lots of people will look back on JFK's presidency now and will say, like, oh, does this guy really seem like a liberal? I mean, he'll say stuff about the Second Amendment or whatever, and people will kind of pick that up and be like, oh, look, he's not a liberal. And of course he's not, because the period, the issues are different. But what LBJ does is LBJ totally redefines the Democratic Party. And you can see the weird collapse of the Democratic Party during his presidency. So LBJ is also from a traditional Democratic base. I think he's from Texas. He's a Southerner. But what he does is he says, look, these states' rights guys, the Dixiecrats, as they're called, are kind of weighing down the future potential of the Democratic Party. Why? Well, they're basically a regional power group that's for regional interests. So as other regions and other institutions develop, the Democratic Party can't really accommodate them. So if your whole thing is appealing to states' rights and Southern ways of living, so usually what this tends to actually look like on the ground is segregation, because it's basically pro-white Southerners who are the clientele of the Democratic Party machine, right? So they're just literally doing everything they can to support them and to detriment a potential opposition. What LBJ is realizing is he's realizing, okay, well, African Americans are leaving these states, so being against them, we can't even use our regional authority to combat their political influence, so we should get on board with them. Immigrants are coming to the United States, and that's becoming a growing power base. College-educated people are becoming a growing power base because after World War II, you get the GI Bill. And so lots of people start going to college, and it starts to become an expectation of Americans that they're going to go to college rather than a hope or something like that, or like a positive in your career, or something for only upper middle class and wealthy Americans to do. Instead, starting to become an expectation. And so what he does is he capitalizes on these kinds of things. And so what he does is he calls his new society. And he starts doing all the stuff FDR was doing, but maybe without the kind of blank check that FDR had. And he's doing it unapologetically. So the example I always give, and the reason I bring up the college education statistic, because I think it actually is really important, but also it's because he makes a big deal out of providing student loans. He creates the FAFSA regime we live in today, where people who could not pay for college because they're too poor can always get loans to go to college if they need them through federally subsidized and backed loans and guaranteed loans. So the loan provider will give you a loan, and even if you don't pay it, the federal government will pay it. And so, I mean, everybody at the time is starting to say, well, this doesn't seem like a good financial idea, because then the cost of college will skyrocket, because they'll know that they can charge whatever, because you can always get a loan, and the loan provider will always give you that loan because they know the federal government will pay it off no matter what. And this is just a horrible economic policy. I don't think any human being can look at that and really be like, wow, that's a great idea. But that's not the point. What LBJ is doing, because again, this is how institutions work, is he's trying to increase his clientele and satisfy his clientele. So he's starting to realize that college-educated voters are starting to become a base. And what they want is very similar to what that early Republican college-educated, journalistic, intellectual elite was. And he's starting to say, oh, look, what we can do is we can kind of play into this. And you start to get the growth of the college-educated voter. And today you can see that divide is very stark. So if you've gone to college, you're likely to become a Democrat. And if you haven't, you're likely not to be a Democrat. And what LBJ and the Democratic Party institutions are doing subconsciously is they're feeding into these institution cycles. And so LBJ is not, blatant enough to start attacking overtly Republican institutions yet, like the military, like the FBI, like the CIA, like big business as much. I mean, of course, he's messing around with taxes a little bit, but he is playing this expansion game, and he's giving all of this money to his own institutions, to his own affiliated institutions. And the Dixiecrats are getting pissed off because they're thinking, wait, we're a regional institution. What's going to happen is this federal institution is going to start competing and pushing us out. And that's exactly what does start happening. And LBJ basically just says, yeah, you're right. You guys are losers, and I'm done with you. And the Dixiecrats start to rebel. They create what's called the States' Rights Democratic Party for a little bit. And Strom Thurmond runs. And Strom Thurmond is like really a symbol for this. And it gets into lots of controversies. And it doesn't work. They obviously don't win any elections. They don't get any presidents or anything, and they don't even hurt the Democratic Party that much. But what you do see is this little battle between the North and the South now. So the South, all of these clients affiliated with those Southern regional institutions leave the Democratic Party, and then the same switch that the Mugwumps did when they weren't getting what they wanted from their political party, the Dixiecrats start to slowly trickle into the Republican Party. This is true. A little bit more of this is actually slower than the Mugwumps. The Mugwumps overtly say, we are switching to this party for this reason. But Strom Thurmond eventually becomes a Republican. But if you actually follow what happens in the South, it's a much slower process in this period. Most of the time, there's people still voting for the Democratic Party, and they just slowly start to die out. And are replaced with Republicans who understand these things. And these Republicans start to, and a lot of them, for instance, are actually in evangelical Christian churches already right now. And they're still, since they were before, those evangelical churches are institutions affiliated with the Republican Party a lot of the time. Now, there's some mixed history here, but that basically starts to maintain itself and keep itself going. you can see there are quotes from Barry Goldwater this time, who's the Libertarian Republican candidate that ran against LBJ, I think. He starts saying stuff like he's noticing the growing influence of evangelicals in the Republican Party. Why? What's this backwash coming in? So a lot of what's going on now is those old democratic institutions that were regional institutions are just being destroyed. They don't exist anymore. And so they're going away. And so the clientele of those former institutions are finding new institutions to affiliate with. And a lot of times the institutions that are giving them purpose now are Christian evangelical associations. And those institutions are more important to the Republicans. And those are Republican-affiliated institutions. So rather than seeing an institution pop out from here and go there, what you're seeing is a clientele switch. This is why this is actually very different, I think, than a lot of people portray it as. This kind of, oh, there were racist Southerners. The Republican Party would let them be racist, so they went to that party. Now, to some extent, the libertarian bent of the business interests of the Republican Party, which have always been an element of the Republican Party since its foundation, that interest group does have a similar agenda to those regional institutions, which want a weak federal government. You might be thinking, when are we actually going to get to talking about the FBI? And this is about where we start. So then Nixon becomes president after LBJ. And what LBJ did was he kind of revamped the federal government, and it was pretty obvious that he's doing a lot of revamping. And what Nixon's approach is not what we will be used to Republicans doing, and we'll see more of that strategy later. What he starts doing is he starts saying, okay, well, I can use the federal government for me too, can't I? And you'll see him use the FBI and the CIA and all these things. You know, people look back on the late 60s, early 70s, and some of the movements and some of the actions of the FBI with derision today. Both left and right people look back and they say, hey, I think things like MKUltra, not so good. Kent State Massacre, which was another thing where it's the kind of the government going up against a growing radical movement. Interestingly, a college campus, we talked about this with LBJ, and the kind of growing infrastructure of college-educated characters as a clientele. But he's kind of attacking that with, again, trying to attack the student movement. Nixon definitely frames himself in opposition to these growing radical new clientele. The boomers kind of have this very spoiled, very college-educated radicalism that is ideological. It's kind of similar in some ways to that kind of muckraker past that the Republicans used to take advantage of in American history. But it's mixed with a new kind of intellectualism, a postmodernism that is a little concerning to some people. Anyway, Nixon tries to do, and so he's not afraid to make new government bureaucracies like the EPA, for instance. And he kind of just assumes, well, okay, well, I'll make sure that the president appoints that person. And what Nixon does during his administration is a lot of it is the president going to war with Congress on things like spending. And he thinks, okay, well, I control the presidency, and what I'll do with the presidency will be all these great things. What ends up happening is he kind of loses this institution game. But Nixon was playing it too. Why does Nixon lose this institution game? Well, Watergate, for one, he totally discredits the Republican institutions by the end of his administration. And you get Ford pardoning him, and it's just a total collapse. All of those Republican institutions now lose. All the institutions affiliated with Nixon, all the ones he was supporting, all the ones he was putting his power behind, lose not necessarily institutional power, but they do lose clientele support. They lose faith. People kind of want a feel-good, moral president again. And Jimmy Carter is quickly made president. However, Jimmy Carter is more the product of that requirement for a moral president than anything like a power player. He doesn't do all these games. He's reluctant to engage in aggressive politics abroad. He's no Woodrow Wilson or FDR. And so he immediately loses his position of prominence as well and gives way to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan takes a very different strategy to Nixon. Whereas Nixon was creating new institutions like the EPA, Reagan was defunding them. What Reagan did instead was he said, okay, I can't make my own institutions. The game does not work both ways, kind of. And so he starts to drastically cut spending towards the institutions in the other camp, in the Democrat camp, and increase. And people think Reagan's a hypocrite for claiming to be a libertarian, but then of course he increases spending on the military and everything. Of course, right after Reagan's administration is when we see the largest defunding of the United States military in the 90s and the early 2000s because of the perceived world peace. But he's kind of spending on the affiliated institutions, on the Republican institutions, and defunding the Democratic institutions. And of course, people pick up on this, and the media and all of the affiliated clientele against Reagan really go nuts. This is kind of the first time, in my opinion, that you do see this institutional backlash. Nixon got a lot of backlash, popular backlash from students and young people, and he gets a lot of backlash in retrospect from movies and things like that. But Reagan really gets this like ire of this growing coastal elite of college educated folks. They really think he's just stupid, and they hate him and they don't like him. You can see at this time there's a infamous statistic where if Democrats were asked how inflation was going, they would say it was getting worse, even when showed statistics of the time that inflation was getting better. It was actually shrinking, and that the inflation rate was shrinking, and that the economy was doing well. Something like that. I actually might be misquoting. You can look that up if you want. But basically, you start to see this institution battle intensifying. But Reagan's strategy in general, and I would say the libertarian strategy of what would become Generation X conservatives, was kind of just back off. Let's decrease the power of the federal government. They kind of are going back to the Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover approach of like reduce, reduce, reduce. The people we don't like. And Reagan is still adding in a little bit of the, like, let's pump the institutions we do like. So the FBI, the CIA, military, police, those institutions in America at the time that are affiliated with the Republicans and conservative control, he's pumping those with power, money, and influence. But of course, he can't live forever. You kind of go into, what are we going to do with this military? You get into the George H.W. Bush period where they end up going into the Middle East a lot and this intervention, and the military starts to get a little bit of a dog wagging the tail thing, the tail wagging the dog thing, and it starts to get a little out of hand, I think some people might say. However, this institution game is still to the detriment of Ronald Reagan in the long run. I mean, you can look at electoral maps like this and say, wow, he must have gotten like a total, revolution. I mean, people talk about the Reagan Revolution. He must have totally revolutionized America, but because his MO was do nothing or do less or decrease government authority and control, he ended up having a very limited institutional impact on our country, which I think a lot of conservatives can reasonably lament. However, he does maintain the existing Republican elite. He's definitely very affiliated with business interests and the military and things like that. And of course, reducing taxes also helps the business interest institutional power base of the Republican Party that goes back pretty much since the beginning. What you'll start to see shifting in the early 2000s is you get a kind of growing populist Republican Party. And they inherit a lot of the truisms of what the institutional leaders have told them about, or have kind of imparted to them about laissez-faire economics, and they're associated all of this kind of small government talk. But in reality, what they're reacting to is the Ronald Reagan time, like, he gave lip service to like evangelical causes, and he got lambasted for things allegedly that were socially conservative, like again, paying lip service to abolishing Roe v. Wade, which he didn't do, paying lip service to being pro-life, pro-evangelical Christian, all these things, saying all of the right words, but nothing really was actually happening. Nothing was really being delivered to the growing clientele of that shifted agricultural, rural, evangelical Republican base that kind of migrated into the party. Now, in the Midwest, they'd been strong Republican voters since the third party system, but there was also this new, larger wave coming in as a result of that Dixiecrat exile. And that clientele is kind of shifting to the Republican Party. They're very patriotic. They're still very undereducated. They're also still very mad. And it doesn't seem like America is going well for them. Clientele can really tell when you're delivering on your political patronage. This is also why they're very angry about DEI stuff. What is DEI if at the end of the day not just saying you are our affiliated groups, we will reward you with political, economic, social positions because you're affiliated with us? I mean, there's a lot of lip service stuff, conversations going on, but if you take out the most left-wing voters, this is a Pew data about which groups of the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party, vote which way. If you take out the most left-wing voters of the Democratic Party is actually majority minority. So what does that mean? Well, the most college-educated white Democrats are very radical, left-wing politically. And so if you cut them out and don't count them, and you just say, well, what about the other Democrats? Most of them are ethnic minorities who are moderate liberals. And those moderate liberals who you can identify based on basically just party loyalty, that's the thing that you're seeing there, because they're not diehard political believers in some message that you can subvert. So, for instance, if you have a diehard radical belief, you're not actually that loyal to the political party. You're usually loyal to the ideas. And you can see this where there are lots of very left-wing people who are very upset with the Democratic Party. They hate Joe Biden. They like people like AOC or Bernie Sanders, and they don't actually have that much loyalty. The groups of Americans who do have a lot of loyalty to just the Democratic Party are people who have affiliations that just feel like they kind of owe the Democratic Party. They have this kind of, we've always voted Democrat. I grew up Jewish, and you can see a lot of that in Jewish voters today. My grandpa, to the day he died, loved FDR, and so he would always vote for the Democratic Party. Didn't matter why. You could talk to him about issues, and he would totally disagree with the Democratic Party, but he had this general party loyalty, and that's the strongest with those affiliated clientele. And so that affiliated clientele will get promoted because they're of their loyalty, and that's how you fill these institutions and you get this institutional power. What ends up happening is you get this basic, the progressive institutions are starting to dominate society in a way that is scary, I would say, to a lot of the conservative clientele, and doesn't feel like the conservative clientele have their affiliated institutions anymore. They start to feel like, hey, okay, it looks like the federal government is gaining more and more control over all these things. And it's not as much, I think, a matter of actually like, oh, these people are just diehard ideological libertarians. They hate the government having power. But they just know deep down that those affiliated institutions don't see them as clientele. And they don't see them as people they have to help or support. I mean, that's why the really galvanizing things that have been said in the last 10 years are when that we kind of, you snap on and you're like, that's it, is when Hillary Clinton calls most of Americans deplorables. You can see there's this kind of, the institutions of our country are at war with this base of Americans who now are institutionalists to a large extent. And they had their Republican institutions. They had big business affiliated guys who claimed to support them. They had evangelical guys like Jerry Falwell and other people who said they were kind of for them. But those guys didn't do much. Reagan was supposed to be for the small, rural, evangelical American. But it didn't seem like he built any institutions that would take care of them. And slowly, you can read books like Bowling Alone. All of these other institutions are dwindling as well. Fewer people are going to church than ever before. When the infamous statistic that Bowling Alone is based around is that Americans used to go bowling in leagues. Now the average American who goes bowling by themselves, and they just join tournaments. These kinds of things in our society's institutions are just disappearing. And so what that means is there's all of these people in America who are totally atomized clientele. They have no institutions affiliated with them. They have nothing to lose from a total destruction of the institutions. And you see this in the early 20th century, right after, and then, of course, a lot of financial institutions collapse. Things like mortgages, homeowners associations in 2008 really go downhill. And you can see this kind of populism start to grow with the Tea Party. Figures like John Boehner, who was a Republican stalwart, is forced to resign because he was negotiating with Obama about, cutting a deal with Obamacare and trying to get some compromises. John Boehner is playing this political game where he's kind of trying to get compromises between the existing institutions, these existing political offices. But the irony is Obama, who was seen as an outsider coming in, not really a part of the institutions, is bringing this kind of populist democratic fervor, and he's trying to be an institutional Republican, and he's not getting that populist fervor from his base. In fact, he's getting constantly bombarded as an outsider and a traitor, and you shouldn't compromise on Obamacare was the big scandal at the time. But I think what this is saying is that there's a huge number of conservative people who are saying, where the heck are my institutions? Where the heck is my institutional support? Stop compromising with those people and start building something for me. And I think that part of that is genuine blame to be put on Republican Party politicians, but also, again, it's just the general degrade of all of those institutions that before made American life so rich in our history that there's this plethora of institutions everywhere, of various affiliations, that so much so that every person in America had a number of institutions that were affiliated with, all that saw them as clientele to be treated well, to be treated appropriately, I guess you could say. Now we don't really have those, and there are a lot of Americans who don't have those, and they're living very depressed lives. And what institutions are being created and what institutions are being fostered in America today are explicitly, verbally being fostered in a way that they will not benefit white rural Americans. And so these people are being left institutionless, and people that have no institutions, they have nothing to lose, tend to be very radical, and they tend to be very violent. They tend to be very uncompromising. And so many people won't be surprised to see where this ends up. You get Donald Trump. I think in a lot of ways, Donald Trump is their attempt at creating power by pure populism. In some ways, he's a Teddy Roosevelt. In some ways, he's kind of a fibber because, he knows how to use the language to make people feel good, but he's just doing it for his own, political gain. I mean, I feel like if you look at his campaigning in 2016 when LGBTQ rights were not as hot button in Christian circles as they are today, and there was kind of this, whatever attitude about the issue, he was selling T-shirts like LGBTQ for Trump, all these things. He just wanted to win, and then he realized what language did he use to get in? Things like drain the swamp, make America great again. There were these things of, look at all these institutions we have to fight against. He was very good at using the language to signify that he was going to fight against those institutions. And in some sense, with the Supreme Court as a good example, he was very good at appointing judges and justices in those overt ways. But I don't think he had the kind of mind that people like FDR or Woodrow Wilson or LBJ had, where he is playing this long-term institution creation game. And conservatives have been pretty bad at this, actually. And so what he didn't do was he didn't change the education system, which starts with LBJ, an education reform, but it goes all the way back to that third-party system. What he didn't do was he didn't align himself with Republican institutions. You can see that once he gets into office, he starts appointing at the very beginning of his administration all of these old party Republican guys into all these offices, like the FBI, like the State Department, like all these places. But what he's realizing is those people aren't actually affiliated with his clientele. Those people are affiliated with dead clientele or big business clientele or whatever, old party clientele. But he represents an entirely unaffiliated clientele who don't have institutions. So he's constantly replacing experts, quote unquote, or officials or whatever from institutions' recommendations. He's constantly being like, wait a second, you don't match up with my clientele. Kind of throwing them out, kind of replacing them constantly. And you can see that battle there. And what he is affiliating himself with are maybe some of these more grassroots institutions that are slowly building. Grassroots news organizations, which are becoming more and more popular. Think even about the origins of the Daily Wire. Daily Wire is incredibly influential now in conservative politics compared to Fox News. Fox News is kind of dwindling, which was maybe more affiliated with the old Republican Party. I say old Republican Party. Of course, it was affiliated with the Flash Republican Party of the early 21st century. But now the Daily Wire is kind of secondary media source. There's these new institutions that are kind of building up. Even they're a little bit weary about Donald Trump, because I think Donald Trump isn't affiliated with any institutions at all. He's not very institution building mindset. Doesn't really have that mindset. But this is why it feels like in his battles with the FBI must be left wing or something. Why? Well, the FBI is actually, I would say, affiliated with those older Republican institutions. But those older Republican institutions are dead. I mean, they're not really in charge of the Republican basis clientele anymore. Now, they're not the same thing as the Democrats. I think that's the confusion here. You'll still see them arguing with Democrats on actual political issues, and they do not have the same clientele. And you can sit in a room with one of these kind of old style Republicans, and they will think DEI is stupid, and they will think that we need to have a strong foreign policy, and they will think all these other conservative things, and they'll be pro-life or whatever. But they're not affiliated with the same group of Americans who put Donald Trump into office. That's why they're fighting him, because they know how institutions work, and the institution that they're associated with has a different opposing clientele to the clientele of Donald Trump. And so you're seeing that war play out. Now, I think part of it is a lot of these old style FBI Republicans still believe in this kind of 1950s, 1960s America, rule of law stuff. They're kind of like the Whigs. I mean, this is a lot of the stuff that they would talk about if you read the early 19th century conservative politics. They think there's nothing really wrong with big business, this kind of stuff. And that's where they're at. And so when they see Donald Trump skirting the rules and playing around them and being unforgiving towards American institutions, kind of lashing out like a loose tiger that his base wants him to be against these institutions that are totally ignoring them, they start to say, hey, wait, you're not really playing by the rules. And he's kind of not, because that was kind of the point, right? The rules, the institutions, the formation of our government was kind of what he was oriented to destroy. And the FBI is an institution. It is. Of course it is. That's the whole point of the institution. It was originally an institution affiliated with Republican Party politics, but we've slowly seen the conglomeration of all institutions in the United States into this kind of federal bureaucracy of, are you for or against the federal bureaucracy that is the heirs to the FDR era regime? And that's the Democratic Party. In some sense, that's why you get such an eclectic bunch of characters. And that's why when you look at Pew Research data about the Democratic base, it's very wide. It's very different. There's very different policy goals. Mostly what unites them is this kind of formative experience in their late teens, early 20s in college or high school, where they get the party manifesto about the importance of the bureaucracy. And in some ways, the bureaucracy has grown so large, it's attacked so many institutions. You can see how they've affected even the military. A lot of people who go to the military now are like, wait, what? They'll sit through a bunch of DEI stuff in the military affiliated things. They'll sit through a bunch of the normal stuff about, whatever. They'll receive that education you receive as a budding Democrat in the military. And the police are being reduced. No brainer, by the way, when you look at American politics through this lens, that the Democrats were okay, or if even supportive of defunding the police. The police are literally one of the strongest, most applicable Republican Party affiliated institutions. They had physical power, they had authority, they had community respect, and for the most part, cops were conservative. That's just kind of a truism, and so that was really important. Okay, so if you're this budding monopoly creator bureaucracy, what your whole point would be to attack, identify, and destroy opposing institutions, and the police would be one of those. And so now that the Republicans don't have any affiliated institutions, they've resorted to populism. And the FBI, if anything, is very good at attacking populism and populists. That was what it was created by Nixon to do during the 60s and the 70s. Of course, the FBI predates Nixon, and even before then, they were doing lots of stuff against radicals and populists. But today, really what a populist is just a client without an institution. And America used to be pretty good at cleaning those people up. You can compare Teddy Roosevelt's reintegration of the uncliented Midwestern Americans who didn't have any institutions because they were out in the frontier, and they were very radical, and they wanted populist reform, and they were anti-big business. Teddy Roosevelt kind of brings them into the Republican Party and assimilates them as normals. But what you're seeing with Donald Trump, and I think the populism today, is that it's attacking violently all institutions altogether. And, I think some people cynically look at that and they say, well, that's stupid. How are we going to win any battles that way? And that's true, but, you got to be a little honest. Look at the Republicans who came before Donald Trump who tried to play the game. Right? Look at Nixon, who tried to create his own institutions, tried to create parallel bureaucracies. It didn't really work. I think this monopoly over the education system means that any expert who gets that far today is going to be affiliated with the Democratic bureaucracy rather than some competing Republican bureaucracy. Even big business today is realizing that it's not really worth the hassle of struggling against those blue institutions. And the blue institutions, I say blue, like Democrats are blue, right? Those blue institutions have basically agreed, hey, big business, if you stop supporting our opposing institutions, we won't be that, vitriolic about taxes and all these kinds of things. And at first, I think that worked briefly. And there was a little bit of, Obama paying off bankers after the collapse, and there were economic reasons for that too. And Hillary Clinton, I think, was maybe this idea, we'll get a business-friendly. Bill Clinton was very like this, a business-friendly Democrat, so that we don't have to be at war with the blue institutions. I just also think that you're seeing kind of maybe grassroots Democrat making that impossible, and you're starting to see some jostling back and forth, and the business interest institution in the Republican Party still has a chip in the game. They're the kind of the mugwumps. They're kind of the third, like, which way are they going to fall on this? Regardless, this was a long video. I hope this makes sense now about why you can kind of see why the FBI might seem like a left-wing organization when they're not really ideologically left-wing. Really what they are is they're an institution preserver, right? They are an institution, and the right wing today is kind of anti-institution in general, which, for better or for worse. This is just my 2 cents as a guy who knows a lot about history and likes to talk about it and likes to think about it. All right, if you've watched this far into the video, I think you're legally obligated to subscribe and like the video and follow for more stuff and, give me some feedback and what you think. Thank you. God bless.